What were the major drivers of human evolution? Something must have caused us to get big brains and become the way we are. But what? A lot of people think that it's meat. I'm not so sure. Hello everyone, I'm Tom Stanton, and today I want to talk about what I think are the major drivers of human evolution. If you think this is interesting, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment if you want to comment, and we will discuss this below or whatever. So, the major drivers of human evolution, as I see it, I think the big thing that happened several million years ago, 6 to 7 million years ago, there were chimp-like ancestors, and they were forced out of their forest because of climate change. So one of the big drivers of human evolution has to be climate change. And then for a few million years, our ancestors were upright walking, walking on two legs, but eating a lot of the same things that chimps and bonobos and gorillas would have eaten, except that they probably had a new fallback food, a new backup food when other foods were not available, and that likely would have been root vegetables. And eventually, Australopithecus probably became pretty well adapted to root vegetables because they had enormous molars that would have been good for crushing and grinding hard, tough foods. Picture, chewing a raw carrot, and we're talking, tougher foods even than that. All day long, they could have been chewing these, and it would have been a good backup source of food when fruits and leaves were unavailable. And eventually, they would have probably become pretty well adapted to eating those roots. And then, about 2.5 million years ago, I think one of the big drivers, I think then one of the drivers would also have been climate change. The earth got cooler and drier. And in East Africa, it probably still would have been hot and dry. There would have been seasonal fluctuations in weather. One thing that happens when the weather gets hot and dry is there are wildfires. And I think fire was also one of the major drivers of human evolution. I think I already mentioned that Australopithecus was probably eating root vegetables. Once you add fire to root vegetables, there's a big caloric boost that you get from the root vegetables once you cook them. Some root vegetables, like, you can double their calories by cooking them. So when you add fire to root vegetables, then that can be a pretty potent combination for pretty potent combination nutritionally, but also the fire can provide some safety benefits as well. I think 2.5 million years ago, probably something that happened was there was a population of Australopithecus that entered the first stage of fire use, simply not being afraid of fire anymore, or maybe even seeking it out, thinking, hey, that looks pretty interesting. If they had done that, they would have stumbled into what are called burned habitats, places where there had been a wildfire. And the foods available in the burned habitat would have been of higher quality because they would have been cooked, partially cooked. They would have been softer, easier to chew. They would have, the root vegetables probably would have been more abundant because more and more plants would have stored their energy underground to protect them from wildfires. So I think Homo habilis was the effect of Homo habilis evolving was caused by a population of Australopithecus entering the first stage of fire use, not being afraid of fire anymore. And then we have, from Homo habilis to Homo erectus, I think that was probably a population of Homo habilis entering the second stage of fire use. The 3 stages, really quickly, are not being afraid of it anymore, harnessing wildfires, being able to control it, and then finally the 3rd stage is creating it. So I think a population of Homo habilis, if they had harnessed natural wildfires, maybe spread the wildfires a little bit, that would have been entering the 2nd stage of fire use. And again, the combination of root vegetables plus fire, more consistent fire, larger areas of fire, would have been a strong combination, both nutritionally and for safety. And I think that the changes that we see with Homo erectus line up pretty well with what you would expect if a population of Homo habilis had started making these burned habitats bigger and settling down in the middle of them, because they had bigger brains, smaller teeth and guts. They became hairless, which, if the earth was cooler and drier, why would you want to be hairless? Well, to protect you from fire that you're working with now. And they had arms adapted for throwing, likely because they didn't need to be adapted for climbing anymore. They had legs adapted for longer distance travel, even running, which I think makes sense if you have to get from one burned habitat to the next in a single day safely. I think all of these changes make sense if you look at them through the lens of saying, okay, well, they probably ate a lot of root vegetables, and combining root vegetables with fire would have been very beneficial for them. And then the last stage of fire use, actually creating fire, I think there's reason to believe that maybe around 800,000 or a million years ago, humans were finally able to create fire. Yes, I know that's like a million years later than when they could actually control it, but I think that's pretty reasonable. It's so much easier to control a fire that's already going than to create it, especially if you don't already know what could create it other than lightning strikes. So I think there might have been almost like a million-year gap between when early humans could control fire and when they could create fire. And once they could finally create it, then when you have cooked starch all the time, it's always cooked starch anytime you want to eat, then I think that makes sense to say, okay, well, that's when humans got our adaptation for genetic mutation for extra starch digesting enzymes in our mouths. Salivary amylase is more useful for cooked starches than for raw starches. So I think the fact that those two line up pretty well, I think that makes sense actually. And then that they also line up pretty well with Homo erectus becoming Homo heidelbergensis, obviously just a population of Homo erectus becoming Homo heidelbergensis. Homo erectus continued in other places. But the start of Homo heidelbergensis coincides with when we most likely could create fire consistently, and it also coincides with getting the starch digesting enzyme in our mouths, extra starch digesting enzyme in our mouths. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think they were a cause. I think those things were a cause of Homo heidelbergensis. And that's kind of how I see a lot of human evolution going. The combination of root vegetables plus fire would have been a major driving force behind a lot of the changes that we see, going from Australopithecus first to Homo habilis, entering the first stage of fire use, going from Homo habilis to Homo erectus, entering the second stage of fire use, and going from Homo erectus to Homo heidelbergensis, entering the third stage of fire use. Now, I know that leaves off Homo sapiens at the end, but still, even without that, that still leaves root vegetables and fire as potentially major drivers of human evolution. And some people are going to argue with this, but I really think that a lot of it makes sense. A lot of the pieces fit once you see it through this lens of root vegetables plus fire would have been really important. And as they progressed through the stages of fire use, as they figured out how better to use fire, they were able to get more safety, higher quality foods, more often, and that's what led eventually to Homo sapiens the way we are. I don't think that saying that meat made us human makes as much sense, because to me it just seems like a kind of wishy-washy answer, like, oh well, they started eating more meat with Homo habilis. Like, how? like they weren't well adapted to scavenging. Well, then they even ate even more meat at Homo erectus. Okay, but like how? They weren't adapted to hunting, and Homo habilis would have been needed to be the one getting more meat in order to drive the changes that led to Homo erectus. And then again, Homo erectus to Homo heidelbergensis. I don't see how the answer, like, oh, they just ate more meat every time and that's what led them to become more human. I don't see how that makes sense. I think it's a fun sounding idea to say that we were such great hunters that we outcompeted all these other animals, but I don't think it's logical. I don't think it makes sense. So hopefully there's some people out there who agree with me. I'd love to start a dialogue about this. If you have any comments, please leave them below. If you like the video, please like and subscribe. And I want to thank you for watching, and always remember to eat your root vegetables. Thank you.